Welcome to the second part of Chapter 15. In the first part, I mentioned some reason that organizations might want to change their culture. But there are many other things that organizations can change, like their structure, their strategy, their suppliers, their customer base, their products, their marketing, and so on. What are some of the forces that are driving change? Forces can come from outside the organization as well as within the organization. Things that happen outside the organization in the organization's environment can drive change. For example, economic or political changes. If there's a recession or if our customers have a lower purchasing power, we might need to adjust our product offerings. Political changes, for example, political unrest in one of the countries in which our supply chain is located, might mean that we need to diversify the locations of our supply chain. New political agreements among countries can also represent some new opportunities. For example, when the United States started to improve relations with Cuba, many hospitality and tourism organizations like the cruise line industry or the hotel industry identified an opportunity to expand its services into Cuba, which was a very attractive market for American travelers. Other forces of change include cultural or social changes. When cultural shifts happen in a specific society, that often means that organizations tend to adapt. For example, changing consumer tastes can be a result of cultural shifts within a society. For example, in the United States, there is a growing component of the population which is of Latin American origin. This represents opportunities for organizations to cater to this market segment with products and services that might be appealing. Other demographic changes are also forces of change. There are many different demographic changes that might be relevant. For example, one notable demographic change in the United States and many other developing nations is the aging population. This represents a very interesting, lucrative market segment of individuals who are healthy and have disposable income, and many organizations want to go after this market segment. And so organizations need to pay attention to demographic shifts. Another demographic shift is the growing proportion of women in the workforce, and most families in this country being dual career households. And so these represent additional demographic changes that organizations need to respond to. Industry changes. We've talked about some industry changes when we discussed Interface Carpet in terms of its impact on the carpeting industry and its introduction of carpet tiles, which became the norm in the industry. And so those industry changes can also mean that organizations need to keep up in order to compete with others in their same industry. And finally, technological advancements. Technological advancements enable us to do things better, cheaper, eliminating human error. And so organizations need to pay attention to new technological advancements and integrate those into their operations. All of those are examples of external forces of change, things that happen in the organizational environment. We talked about that when we discussed the importance of environmental scanning and enacting the environment. But many of the forces of change can also happen internally. When there is an issue with reduced performance or low employee satisfaction or increased conflict within the organization, all of those can be indicators of some internal issues that need to be addressed. Many organizations conduct annual employee opinion surveys to make sure that they stay in touch with how their employees are feeling, because they want to be aware of issues with low satisfaction so they can implement the necessary changes on time. Of course, a new leadership or a new mission and vision for the organization are also internal forces of change that require organizations to change. Of course, not all organizational change is going to be dramatic or drastic. We can have incremental changes, tweaking, which are not so significant and are going to generate less uncertainty, less ambiguity, and less likely resistance to change. the more dramatic, the more drastic, the more radical the change, the more likely it is that it will involve a lot of ambiguity, a lot of risk, and high potential for resistance. Because whenever we want to try to generate organizational change, we will have driving forces that seek to disrupt the status quo, the equilibrium. But at the same time, there will also be restraining forces in place. Every organization wants to retain a sort of equilibrium, a status quo, in order to increase stability, predictability, clarity, and reduce ambiguity. And so when we want to implement change, we have to disrupt that status quo. We have to create a shift in this seesaw, so to speak, by increasing the driving forces and reducing the restraining forces. Before we discuss how we can increase the driving forces and reduce restricting forces, we also have to understand that in order for organizational change to be successful, we have to recognize that the unfreezing process takes time. The unfreezing process is the process in which we try to create the shift in the status quo, in which we increase the driving forces and try to reduce the restraining forces so that we can unfreeze the status quo. Then, and only then, can we implement the change. But once change has been implemented, it's also important for the organization to refreeze the new status quo. If employees have the possibility to go back to doing things the way they were before the change will not be successful. For example, when Appalachian State University implemented a new version of As You Learn, we were allowed to keep the old As You Learn and the new As You Learn side by side for one semester, so that faculty would have enough time to transition from the older As You Learn version to the newer As You Learn version. But once the change was complete, at the end of that transition period, the old As You Learn platform disappeared, and we only got to keep new As You Learn. And this is the refreezing process in which we institutionalize the change to prevent people from going back into how things were done in the past. I encourage you to watch this short video on your As You Learn page on how to institutionalize or how to successfully implement organizational change. And you might notice in that video how much attention is dedicated to generating this unfreezing of the status quo. And so very similarly here, when we look at the phases of the change process, there are many things that need to happen before we can actually implement the change. So before the change action happened, there is a lot of groundwork that's happening. The first thing is the diagnosis. Leaders must assess the environment of the organization, environmental scanning, to identify the need for change, possibly through a SWOT analysis. The organization needs to plan for change both strategically and pragmatically. It's not enough to understand how the change will help us accomplish our strategic mission and vision. It's also important to have a pragmatic plan in place of how to actually implement the change. And if you look at the video on your As You Learn page, it will point out how important it is not just to explain to people what is good about the change and how the change might benefit them, but also what is bad about not changing. Many people don't see the risk of not changing, of keeping the status quo, because it is the role of leaders to have the strategic vision and to look outside the organization. They might be very well aware of why the change is necessary for organizational survival. But organizational members who don't have the access to the big picture might not be able to understand themselves why the change is necessary and what might be the risk of not changing. And so it's important to stress not just the benefits of change, but also the risks, the downsides of not changing, right? The alligators, so to speak, in the video. At the same time, leaders who want to successfully implement change must also recognize the risks associated with change. Employees resist change for lots of reasons. One of those is because the risk represents uncertainty, threat to them. And so leaders have to acknowledge those risks, that threat, that uncertainty, to help organizational members overcome their resistance. And of course, leaders also have to understand what is good about the status quo, right? Represented by the mermaids in the video. Because organizational members will focus on what is good for them in the current status quo and ignore what is bad about keeping the status quo as it is. And so when we're trying to lay the groundwork for the organizational change, we have to plan for it both strategically and pragmatically. We have to create a sense of urgency among organizational members. Clearly communicate why the change is necessary so that organizational members are less likely to resist if they understand why the change is necessary and what the risks with the current status quo are. Leaders should articulate a clear change vision, one that's inspiring, one that's exciting. We talked about transformational leadership in the chapter on leadership. Transformational leadership is especially useful when we want to implement change, when we want to articulate an appealing vision of the future to intrinsically motivate organizational members to follow us in our change initiative. And so we want to create an appealing vision, one that we can clearly communicate to organizational members so that we can create a sense of urgency and bring as many people as we can on board. Only after we have done this groundwork have we unfrozen the status quo so that we can actually implement specific changes. It's also recommended in best practices to anticipate and celebrate short-term wins. Many organizations undergo very lengthy change processes. For example, Xerox underwent a 10-year change process in which they sought to become globally integrated so that they could compete with their smaller, more agile, globally integrated competitors, Canon and Ricoh. The change process at Xerox took 10 years. It is very difficult to motivate organizational members to stay with something for 10 years without seeing any results. And so Xerox very strategically planned for different milestones in that 10-year period. And every time a milestone was reached, the organization celebrated it. This helped the organization generate more buy-in and more support for the next phase of the change. One of the first things that Xerox did was integrate their global suppliers from several hundred to several dozen, which helped them reduce costs by several $1 million annually. And so this was a short-term win that the organization could celebrate to generate and build more wins and more change. Once the change has been concluded, we institutionalize the change, we reinforce the change, like the example of the old as you learn disappearing that I gave earlier. And this way, the change continues to exist and people do not go back to doing things the way they were before. Of course, change can be cyclical, and once a change has been concluded, we evaluate whether or not we are where we want it to be. And if we are not, we start the process over again. There are many types of change, and change very often comes from the senior leadership. Senior leaders scan the organizational environment, identify opportunities or threats, and generate changes accordingly. Organizational development is a unique type of organizational change that many organizations choose to follow. Organizational development is different from top-down change in that it puts the people at the center. And organizational development very often uses interventions like focus groups, employee opinion surveys, interviews with employees to identify problems, internal problems and challenges so that the change is very organic and works together with organizational members. And so some of the characteristics of organizational development, which is a type of organizational change, is that it is very people-focused. It seeks to create an open climate to confront problems, to maximize collaboration within the organization across hierarchical levels and across disciplines. It uses rewards based on growth and accomplishment of the mission, not necessarily monetary performance. It seeks to manage conflict constructively, make decisions close to the information source. This is why it's very often rooted in employee opinion surveys or focus groups. And so it is a very people-oriented change initiative that seeks to replace status with knowledge, build trust, and create a win-win climate. One last important point in this chapter is resistance to change. As I mentioned earlier, the more radical the change, the more dramatic the change, the more likely it is that it will be high risk, high uncertainty, with high potential for resistance. Why do employees resist change? And you might watch again that video that I mentioned earlier, and it will give you some examples of why employees resist change. Employees sometimes resist change because of individual disposition. Earlier this semester, we talked about personality. One of the big 5 personality traits is openness to experience. People who rank low on openness to experience are less likely to feel comfortable with change and more likely to resist it. And so sometimes it's our personality which creates increased likelihood that we will resist change. Employees also resist change because change involves uncertainty. Change involves ambiguity, and people have a fear of the unknown. If I don't know exactly what the change involves for me, for my job responsibilities, for my workload, for my job security, I am likely to resist. When employees don't trust senior leadership to make decisions that are for the well-being of all organizational members, again, this creates a climate of mistrust, which might lead to resistance to change. Peer pressure is another variable that drives resistance to change. If my colleagues don't want the change, don't like the change, don't trust the change agent, I might be supportive of them because our relationships are meaningful to me, and so I might resist change as well. I might not like the change agent, him or herself. I might not understand why the change is necessary. We have all heard the saying, if it ain't broke, why fix it? And so if employees don't see where the system is broken, they are not going to see the need for change. They are more likely to resist it. And if we've been successful doing things the current way, we're not going to see a need to change anything. And so what can organizational leaders do to overcome change? If we know why employees resist change, we might be able to help them overcome change resistance. For example, one strategy to reduce resistance is to involve employees in the decision-making. We talked about that in decision-making and discussed the fact that when employees are involved in decision-making, they're more likely to have higher level of understanding and higher level of buy-in. And so if we involve employees in the decisions about the change, they are more likely to understand why the change is necessary and are less likely to resist. If we openly share information regarding the benefits and the risks associated with the change, employees are more likely to support it. If we reduce uncertainty by providing training or support or assurances regarding job security, again, we might be able to reduce resistance to change. So it's important to recognize why employees resist change and plan pragmatically what we are going to do to reduce resistance. Of course, we also want to make sure that change is planned ethically, that when we implement change, we avoid coercion, manipulation, and deception. We need to favor openness and involvement. If we make false promises to our employees, we are very likely to lose their trust. And while it's very easy to lose trust, it's very hard to regain trust when trust has been violated. And so When leaders want to implement change, they have to recognize why employees and why organizational members resist change. And resistance to change is not necessarily going to happen only at the lower levels of the organization. Very often managers, middle managers, and supervisors will also resist change if there hasn't been sufficient attention given to explaining why the change is necessary, how the change will benefit all organizational members, how not changing is actually a liability or a risk, and how we can support all organizational members through the change. And so when we plan for change, we have to make sure that we do so ethically, avoiding coercion or manipulation or deception, because this will not allow us to build a climate of trust in which we can successfully implement change. This concludes our discussion of organizational change. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions.